Many of us have been accustomed to the political parties and what they are. Democrats are these people, Republicans are these people. But all of a sudden, in the last 5 years, we've probably seen a little bit different. Poor people are voting for Republicans, rich people voting for Democrats, unions voting for Republicans, business voting for Democrats. What world do we live in? Welcome to the start of the seventh party system. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. We got a little bit of an early recording schedule going on here, but I'm very thankful to have Daddy Marks joining us once again for our Friday show. How you doing, sir?
Doing very well. Excited for this episode.
I'm very interested to see how good this one is. That last one, which we were talking about in chat, demographics did very well. We'll see how well this one goes. Before I begin, you just got to get those promos out of the way. Geopolitics with Tyberius D is brought to you by our wonderful patron crew of Andy Wagner, The West Dude, Julia, and Drew. We thank you all for your patronage. It's absolutely been a blast to have you guys as part of our community, and we hope that we can add more names to that very soon. Oh, man. What else do we have here? Oh, next week. Or, of course, this episode is going to be coming out on Monday. So this week, actually, if anyone is listening to this or watching it, is that I'm going on vacation. Now, I'm going to try to have some content for you guys a little bit here and there, pre-uploaded, pre-scheduled, but it won't be what you're usually used to. It'll probably be the right-wing panel, among some other things, but at least you'll have something to indulge with. Otherwise, I don't want to just give you guys a cold turkey for a week. But the vacation is almost here, and so I'm going to be touring the South, basically, for about 5 or 6 days. So it's going to be quite interesting. Is there anything else there? I don't know. Okay. Oh, yeah. If you have questions for the AMA, please send that to me, whether on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter. That's places you can contact me. Feel free to ask me pretty much whatever you want. There's very few things I won't answer. And then as far as watching our content, make sure that you're checking it out on Twitch if you want to watch the live show. That's usually at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And then you have the live show or the right-wing panel on Sundays at 9 p.m. So feel free to check that out. If you want to watch it visually, you can always check it out on YouTube. And if you can't do it, you got to do it on the go. Feel free to check out the podcast. You can find that pretty much anywhere. Exact same name, exact same formula. It's just the audio version of this pretty much ripped up. So, without further ado, let's talk about the party systems. Now, I feel bad for having the intro to lead you guys in on this one, where we were talking about the dawn of the seventh party system. We're going to finish that with the end, because a lot of this is going to be a bit of a history lesson. But Daddy Marks, what do you think about the political parties right now? Do you think they are changing, or do you feel like we're just seeing a bit of an anomaly?
Oh, absolutely. Judging from what I've heard you say in the past, it seems like Democrats are starting to lose unions more, especially with Donald Trump's election. People thought it was going to be a blowout. It was actually closer than many people thought. Donald Trump picked up portions of black vote and a big portion, or a statistically significant portion of Latino vote. Just people in general aren't really voting in the ways that they traditionally vote anymore, at least in some aspects of our party systems.
All right. Well, you said it for me. Is that largely you're kind of reiterating some points that I made, and I absolutely agree with that. There's some hard data I might go over towards the end of the episode, but the question is, how did we get here? Why are these party systems important? What matters about them? That kind of thing, right? So let's rewind all the way back to 1796 with the first party system, and this is largely 1796 to 1824 is this era that we kind of think of. And the reason why this matters is that I need to paint the picture of how we went from one system to another and the fundamental changes that bring these out, because It's not just time, it's not just demography, it's issues, change. Things actually do get solved every once now and again, and because of that, we see the political establishment basically flip into a 180 or completely start doing things completely different. So, first party system is largely built around the Federalist Party versus the Democratic Republicans. Why is this an issue? What is the issue of the day? This is largely, as the nation forms, the balance of power between the federal government and the states. And to make this conversation short, because I can deep dive into this a little too much, is that the Federalists believe that the federal government should kind of be like an extension of an absolute monarchy, where it should control most of the ongoings of a nation. They had some points, and actually, if you kind of want to be genuine to their argument, they would eventually win out even after they were long gone, particularly after the Civil War. We'll probably get that here before too long. But the long conversation here is that the Democratic Republicans, they believed that the principles of republicanism would be that it was local government first and you build up from there. And they would dominate the system. The Federalists would win okay here and a bit there. But, the only state that really was a strong Federalist state was Connecticut. Everyone else was either a little lukewarm on them or just hardcore went Republican. Or, if you will, Democratic Republican. We'll call them Republicans for this point, but this is the party that will eventually become the Democrats, actually. So I kind of want to call them Democrats. The Federalists will actually die out as a party. So the long and the short is that the Federalists just couldn't compete very well because a lot of people, and this is the era before, trains and automobiles and all that, is that being governed from a central authority, even one that was as relatively close as Washington to what was, this new country, and remind you that most of this new country would be east of the Mississippi. The last two states to join during this system would be Louisiana and Missouri. So, not a huge country by any stretch of the imagination yet. But even in this day, when everyone has to walk or ride a horse to get there, is that you kind of want to be governed by the people who are closest to you. And that generally is how this bore out, is that a lot of people didn't want a central authority that they had to kiss up to. That's really what they just fought a revolution to get away from. Granted, that central authority was 3,000 miles away in London. So, make a long story short here, is that it's really important to look at where this went, because we had a big conversation about if the federal government should be that strong. And to a large degree, it wasn't. We can talk about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, where he largely just pays for everything with tariffs. And defunds the living crap at everything else, which unfortunately defunded. We didn't have a strong military at this point, but he pretty much brought that to zero, and come the War of 1812 with Madison, afterward, we were not prepared for it, and we largely get our teeth kicked in. As I said, I could do a deep dive on this one. But is there any question that you have for this particular era, Marks, that you want to ask, or do we want to jump to the second party system?
Yeah. This era is still early in American history.
Yes.
I know we broke away from the British, obviously, but are there any aspects of our political system that we sort of adopted from the British system?
Yes and no. A lot of the Enlightenment thinkers looked to Britain at this time as the premier personal liberty kind of society. As weird as that is, because we broke away because we're like, oh, we don't want to be ruled by a king, is that by this time, Parliament's actually pretty important and pretty powerful. The voice of the commoner, granted, this is more of high-functioning landed people, right? And if we want to be honest here, we can even say it's just white people. They dominate pretty much everything that's going on. But this is significantly more than what we had seen throughout the rest of Europe at this time, and even in the British past, where you didn't have to be a duke or a baron or a knight to have a say in political affairs. You could be anyone. Relatively, you had to be landed and male, but at least you could actually have some political reputation without actually being part of the quote-unquote the nobility. that does evolve into what we do here. Now, there is one particular part that we will add on to, and that is a lot of the founding fathers were very, very educated, right? They were the elite of their time, right? They aren't commoners by any stretch of the imagination. They are basically the rich, powerful elite that felt like they weren't treated particularly well as rich people, as landed gentry. And so they broke away, and they did get their own nation. And what they decided to do is not only take lessons from the British system at the time, but they opened up a history book, and they're like, all right, cool. Well, we had Rome, and we had Greece, and we had all that, and a few democracies in the medieval era, such as like Milan or Venice. And they're like, all right, cool. What can we learn here? What do we want to do? This gets the separations of powers. This gets our constitution. I would say that they kind of took a hybridization of what was going on in Britain, and they mixed it with what the Romans did, and you kind of get the constitution that we have today. The presidency is more like the consulship from Rome than it is the prime minister, and you can kind of just build out from there. There's a reason why we didn't follow Parliament tit for tat. One of the biggest things that they tried to avoid, actually, and ironically, early on, is they didn't want political parties. They wanted people to actually come with their own individual issues and get people to vote for them. That lasted all of about 5 minutes, but they tried. Ironically, for this episode, the thing that they tried to avoid more often than not with our system was the party systems. It didn't work out very well for obvious reasons. We can talk about why that is if you want. But I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all my questions. Yeah, we can move on.
Sure. All right, so we're going to jump to the second party system. This era is relatively from 1828 to 1852. This is between what we call the Democrats and the Whigs. This was originally the Democratic Republicans, but basically with the age of Jackson, the modern Democratic Party forms out of the Democratic Republicans, and they're here since then, right? The Democrats have been around for a long time. The Whigs were not the replacement for the Federalists. Not in the way that you would think. They were actually, they had readopted, or I'm sorry, not readopted. The Whigs were the left-wing party of their era, believe it or not, and they were basically America's first more liberal left-wing party. They are not there to say that they want a strong central government, although they will pick up a few tantamount points here and there that will kind of lead towards that. But their big thing is the advancement of social liberties for people. Basically, they figured that if they can get more people to vote, they'll have more voters, and they're not entirely wrong here. Now, they won't have a very big impact on social policy. They're kind of weak, and the Democrats at this era will basically dominate the party system again. But they do move the country in a way that is far more familiar to us today, and that is, you have largely a states' rights conservative party in the Democrats. Yes, the Democrats were that party at one point. And then the Whigs are kind of what the Democrats are today. They didn't believe in the social welfare state. That's a new ideas that didn't even come out at this point. But they do believe in, I would say they're the more libertarian party. They believe that, people should be empowered politically, and they would push for that. Unfortunately, what's the major issue of the day? It's slavery. And a lot of this will be the political divide between pro-slave and anti-slave states. And this is how you get some states that are drawn out that are, I've mentioned this many, many times if you're familiar with watching the show, is that this is how you get some weird states drawn out that really shouldn't be there. Texas is way too big. California is way too big. They're not drawn worth a damn. The only state that comes out of this era that actually makes any sense is Maine. Everything else is just largely kind of weird. I'll be honest, maybe Arkansas and Iowa I can live with, but a lot of these states that are added during this time are drawn in ways that are really screwed up, and it'll cause a lot of problems. And basically, it's you'll have the Missouri Compromise, and what is it? The Missouri Compromise, and you'll have another one. I can't remember what it is, but all of this is related to the balance between two.
The Compromise of 1850 or
You'll have
1860.
the 1850s, the one. You'll have that one,
Yeah.
yes. And to make the long story short here, is that all of this phase is largely predicated upon not abolitionism, but basically the balance between the slave states and the free states, because the biggest problem with the Whigs, and we'll get to this going into the third party system, they're not an abolitionist party. They're more for social liberty, but honestly, everyone's a little racist during this time. Like, even the Whigs didn't pick up abolitionism because they looked at the black community as basically subhuman. Now, I'm not going to say that was all of them, but that was the majority of them. They didn't care about this as an issue because the temperament is that they really weren't people. Like, this is the era that, somewhat of the era, although this is more of a fallout of the 3/5 Compromise and that kind of thing. What brings this system to an end is actually that abolitionism will become a major political issue, and the Whigs will refuse to pick it up, and you'll get another party that'll pop out of here in 1856 that is for abolitionism. And can you name me what that party is, anyone?
Democrat.
Republicans.
Ooh. Oh, because abolition. Yeah,
Yeah.
I forgot about that. My bad.
So that would actually move us to the third party system. But if chat has any questions to ask, or if you have questions, excuse me, if you have any questions about the second party system, feel free to ask that.
Two-party system. As a result, of the Republican Party, you said that it solely came from slavery because that was the big issue of the time. I just want to clarify. Right?
The big issue with the second party system is slavery. It's largely the balance between the free states and the slave states, and the balance in the Senate. Like, that's literally the entire conversation as a whole. The thing that brings it to an end is that, and actually this will actually be the formation of the Republican Party, is that you had a liberal party in the Whigs that would not pick up abolitionism as a legitimate political conversation point. They would not say it. They did not push for it as a party, and it got so bad that people either left the party or they started they formed a new one, and that was Republicans. They form in 1850. I think it's like 1852, 1853, and they'll actually run a presidential contender in 56. They don't get it strong enough yet, but then we'll get to 1860, and you know who that is.
Looking at that. No, I guess I don't have any questions for this area. I think I know pretty much about it.
Gotcha. So, third party system is the 1856 to 1892. This is the dawn of what we think of as modern politics here between the Republicans and the Democrats. Republicans get their kind of first real thing going in 56. And then you'll have the election of Abraham Lincoln, which is a Republican in 1860, that basically puts them on the radar. And of course, this is the Civil War. This party system screwed up in so many ways. The voters will vote on their political party lines continuously, and that Republicans were the liberal party at the time. Yes. Democrats would be the conservative party at the time. Yes, that was a thing. And the issues will largely be big businesses, like what we think of as like the old Republican Party from just a few years ago. That largely, for tit for tat, was the Democratic Party at this time. Republicans, to some degree, the same as the Democrats. Like, literally, you can invert them. The difference is that this is the era before the social welfare system. This is before anything like Social Security or all that stuff. So only at the end of this political party system do we see quote-unquote socialists and all that actually come here. Because remind you that Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital in the 1850s, if I remember correctly, or like early 1860s. So this is all going on, but these are ideas that are only going to catch on in Europe in the 1870s and 1880s. They don't even really get here until the academic papers and the immigrants come over that kind of bring the ideas and stir up the conversation. That'll largely end this era to some degree. So we'll talk about this. There's three phases that this party system goes through. Number one's the Civil War. Obviously, that's 1861 to 1865. And the election of Abraham Lincoln, that's what it all kicks off with. I don't know how well y'all know your history, but I'll put it this way. You largely have the Civil War. That is the trying to balance what the states' rights are. Because people are just like, no, your state's right isn't to have slaves. And this will largely lead into Reconstruction. And because of the Civil War, you will see a significant increase of the powers of the federal government. And to give you an idea here, because of the War Powers Act that's kind of brought up at this time, Abraham Lincoln will suspend habeas corpus, which, if I remember correctly, is the Fourth Amendment. I could be wrong here. I don't have my amendments completely lined out the way I should. Sorry, I'm not as amazing constitutionalist. But he will literally suspend the procedures of a constitutional amendment because we are at war with ourselves. Because from this point on, we'll actually see largely outside of towards the middle of this party system, an ever-increasing and ever-strengthening federal government, particularly the presidency, but that actually this is the last era where the presidency isn't stupidly important. But it's the era where it really begins to gain importance on levels that you haven't before seen. For all the powers of Jackson and George Washington, they pale in comparison to the people that will follow after this era. Reconstruction happens. Reconstruction being that the North is basically occupying the South as an occupied territory. We have to let them back in at some point, and we do. And there's a lot of Republicans that are free down there that will be voting, particularly black Republican voters. But there's a problem. The United States kind of goofed. And this is a very hot topic political take here to some people. But the problem that we kind of have after the Civil War is that we don't go through deconfederation. Most of the time when you would defeat people in a civil war, you would destroy them. You would destroy everything that they believed in. You would basically wipe their ideology and I'm not going to say their personhood, but you would largely wipe out whatever you thought caused the war in the first place. So it would be illegal to have, they would make it illegal to even have a Confederate flag. All the people that would have been Confederates would have been tried and executed for treason, or at least, hit in certain ways. That never happens. And that's largely because the president after Lincoln, which I believe is Johnson, he gets the office because Lincoln is assassinated. And the problem with Johnson is that he pardons the entire South in one fell swoop. There was a big political issue on that, but however, he technically had the power to do so, or at least the Supreme Court decided that he did, and no one ever goes to jail for the Civil War. No one is ever executed for the Civil War. And what will happen over the era of Reconstruction is that the North will largely get tired of policing and running the South, and eventually, come about 1876, 1877, the North will writ large pull their troops out, and they will give back the South to the Democrats, which most of them are largely former Confederates that actually ran the government 10 and 50 years prior. We're still paying a cost for that to this day. And so what will happen from this point out is that while the Republicans will kind of dominate this era to a large degree, the Democrats are going to gain steam from the end of Reconstruction onward, and it's about 1880? I can't remember exactly. You'll see a Democrat in the presidential office again. What you'll see during this time is that once the North-South divide is largely kind of not forgotten, but largely takes a second foot, this is the era of unions and labor strikes and all that will eventually start to bring this party system to an end. and that is the Gilded Age. You'll start to see the Rockefellers and all these other people that you know as common names, J.P. Morgan. Those folks, this is their heyday. This is where they start taking off. And as the economic situation changes in the United States, where we start growing immensely and more powerful economically, basically the long conversation short here is that come the end of this era, the Gilded Age is in full swing. Is that we have extremely rich people. You have railroads being built everywhere. This is the modern industrial manufacturing base of the United States that will go on all the way up to World War II. This is labor rights, all of that. This kicks off at this time. And as the problem with these parties is that the Democrats actually make themselves pretty well known for being the business folks at this point. That's actually kind of how they get themselves back into political relevancy, is that they make highly business and business-leaning people vote for them. And the problem with the Republicans at this point is that they'll basically drop the ball for a bit in metabolizing workers' rights into something that they can run with. There's a few reasons for that, but I don't want to get too much in the history because this is actually what brings in the fourth party system. But if you have any questions, chat or marks on the third party system, we can hit that now.
Not specifically. If you wouldn't mind, I wanted to go back a little bit to Reconstruction just to clarify.
Sure. Sure.
Because you said like the North got tired. Do you know of any reasons, like specifically why they got tired? Was it specifically taxing on like Northerner troops? Did they just stop caring? Do you know why?
Yes, I do. You actually hit one of them right there. Is that the North was literally occupying the South. Okay, and what you had is that you literally had Northern troops, people from Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania, were going down and sending their kids and their sons and all this other thing down to the Southern states and basically telling them how to live their lives. It's not very fun, and honestly, it's one of those things that you would almost consider anti-American to do. We don't like to tell people what to do with themselves to a large degree. That's changing over time, but sorry, I'm derailing a little bit. Number one, it costed a crap ton of money, right? We weren't Reconstruction wasn't really reconstructing to a large degree. We basically made the South an occupation zone, and there wasn't a lot of major economic development in the South. The North literally had to send their bureaucrats and their dignitaries down to the southern states and basically help run everything, because I don't know how to say this without maybe triggering somebody, but I have to say it this way. A lot of people that were Republicans in the South that could help run the show didn't know how to run anything, because a lot of them were either freed slaves or people that were largely persecuted without like major tools and education or the political connections that would actually allow you to run a state. And so you had to basically bring in a bunch of Northern Republicans down from the North to actually help them run the whole thing. The long short story short here, and I can get into more details on this if you want, is that the North will eventually get tired of doing this. They get tired of sending people down there where everyone who isn't a Republican hates them. They don't really like occupying them or occupying the area, and it'll eventually just build up into, it's a bit of a slow roll where they'll stop giving a crap, and then they'll kind of be re-engaged. And I'll basically surmise it as this, right? At first, the North will be like, all right, well, we have to do it. And then it'll kind of bleed off for a minute. And this is more towards the end of the 1860s. It starts withering away because it sucks. And then all of a sudden you hear about these people called the Ku Klux Klan, which are formed at this time, and what they're doing down in the South. And they're basically turning the South into a second Civil War. It gets bad. Like, people are literally burned. Buildings and houses are burned. The worst of humanity is kind of on display at this point. And the Northerners don't particularly like it. However, it invigorates them enough that they'll actually like redouble down onto handling this. And you'll have Ulysses Grant. This is actually one of the few things that he does very well during his presidency. granted, former general who literally invaded the South, so he kind of knew what he was doing. He will lead I want to say persecution for some reason, but actually it's basically an outright campaign to destroy the Ku Klux Klan, and he will succeed to a large degree. It doesn't completely get wiped out, but there's only a few scattered remnants left of them whenever this era comes, or this part comes to an end. The problem is, after this kind of gets handled, and this is really about 1872, 1874, is that between the scandals going on in the Grant administration, because he's a general but he's not a politician at all, is that the North will kind of lose focus on what's going on, and then two is that you'll have a number of things going on in the South that basically just tire the crap out of the North, and then come 1876, 77, they just don't want to do it anymore. And they literally make the conscious decision that, look, the only people that can run the South are the Southerners, and they make the conscious decision to give it all back. And you will literally have former Confederates who are Democrats come back, and they'll basically sweep the South within 5 years. And almost every Southern state will become a Democratic stronghold, with the exception of one or two. And it all happens within one election cycle. So,
Okay. All right. To save time, I think it's best to move on.
sure. So we're moving into the fourth party system, and this will largely be. And for anyone who wants to know, I am largely following the Wikipedia version of this, although I wanted to do my own kind of thing here, but I like the dates enough where I'll keep with it. This is 1896 to 1928. This system's weird, because you start to see kind of where we're going a little bit more modern. The Republicans will largely dominate this era too, but the Democrats are getting stronger, and well, they'll basically dominate the South like everyone else, but they're... I don't know how to put this. The difference between the third party system, or the end of the third party system, and the fourth party system is largely that Republicans, for a minute, will become the party of labor, and the Democrats are largely the party of business. Sound familiar? What happens that fundamentally changes the equation is that unions stop, doing stuff like strikes and, if you will, honestly, insurrection. And what they'll do is that they will become politically involved and politically, what do you call this? They're politically involved. They're politically active. They are the primary backer of the first Roosevelt administration, Teddy Roosevelt's administration. Not to say that they're the only ones there, but they're one of the biggest differences, and that's why Teddy is so successful at being the trust buster and being the reformist of his era, is that he will largely be the champion of unions. He'll largely be the champion of labor, and that's why he's remembered so fondly even to this day. There's a number of few things on there too. He's basically like the first environmentalist. He starts the national park system. A lot of what we think of as the Democrats or not today, but more of like just 10 years ago, the Democrats of that was the early Republicans back during this time. Irony how we flipped, right? But we'll get to that. But I'm a big fan of Teddy. I'm sorry if that bias is coming out, but the long and the short here, at least for me, is that you will see the Republicans largely find their footing as a pro-labor liberal party that that hits very, very well, and is politically active. And with this, they'll build out a functional political coalition that dominates the era. This will change over time. We'll talk about this a little bit here in just a second, but how do I want to take this? Marks, if you want to help me with this, feel free to do so, because I'm losing my train of thought a little bit.
We're going because we're going past Teddy Roosevelt era. And we're going more into the World War II era right now, which is gonna be a massive, right?
You jumped the gun a little bit, but you actually
Oh,
put me on the right point. You put me on the right path. So the Teddy era is largely almost like a mirror image of what we see during like the 1980s and 90s, except the Democrats are the business people and the Republicans are the labor folks. In every regard, they're very similar to that. What happens largely is World War One.
oh yeah, the Forgotten War. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually Korea, unironically.
Yeah.
World War One comes around, and it changes the game a little bit. Number one is that the Republican Party is a big tent party at this point, and that it has labor, but it also has business interests. And what ends up happening is that Teddy steps down in 1908 because he wants to basically retire, and he served his 2 terms. You have Taft, and he doesn't hate Taft, but what Taft does as his presidency, he'll grow to hate them. And what happens from this point on is that in 1912, Teddy will run as a pro-labor Republican, but then will get kicked out of the party, and he'll make the Bull Moose Party the Progressive Party, right? And he'll run as a pro-labor not right wing, like left wing Republican, and you'll have Taft running as a Republican, but he's pro-business. Sound familiar? Like something going on today? We'll get there in a minute. Taft is a pro-business Republican, and then you have the ultimate evil bastard of all evil bastards, the worst president in United States history, Woodrow Wilson, running as the Democrats. He is the quintessential business Democrat of the era. What is different is that he knows that he has to bring on something that is going to fundamentally like put him over the edge. And this is basically women's rights to an issue to a degree. Wilson's so weird. And like I hate Wilson. Wilson is the worst president in American history by far. I can do a whole rant on this guy. The political parties start changing in a big way. The Democrats start picking up the people that will become the social liberals that will bring in the modern Democratic Party. And the Republicans start picking up business conservatives during this point. And so to make a full cycle short, Wilson will win because his tent is unified and it's more put together and it's bigger. And so with the split ticket of Teddy and Taft losing to Wilson, Wilson basically sweeps it in a landslide. A ridiculous landslide. I think he wins like 40 states, or not 40 states, but he'll win something on the order of over 30 states at this point. In most of the electoral vote. What he really gets famous for is actually the 1916 election. Reminder that World War I is in swing in Europe. A lot of things are getting nasty. American ships are getting sunk, and women's rights are getting first wave feminism. Women's rights is getting very, very strong, very, very powerful. What he basically does is that he runs on 2 things. Number one, I will not get into World War I. Hashtag spoiler alert. And then the second thing he runs on is that he's going to get the women the right to vote. He does that, actually. And so what happens with the Democrats is that World War I the United States will get drug in from the Zimmerman telegram. We get really, really pissed off at Germany, and we'll declare war in literally 6 months after the election, which is funny. But so that campaign promise goes out the door, but we have a pretty good reason to. But the important part here is largely what will happen with Wilson later. And that is, after World War I is over, there's a constitutional amendment, which is Amendment 19, I think. Prohibition happens, and the women get the right to vote. And that will be certified in 1920. And basically, this opens the door for the Democrats to become the socially liberal party that they will evolve into later. And this is kind of where the Democrats start falling apart, is that they have a bit of a manic schism over being socially liberal and having business conservatives in the party. And so you start seeing everybody move. And this is actually what's going to bring the 5th party system before too long, is that business is trying to figure out if they want to be Republican or Democrat, and liberals are trying to figure out if they want to be Democrat or Republican. And basically, those two are about to flip. Before I move on, questions, please.
Questions. Um, World War I era. I don't really know that much about the World War I era. That was actually really enlightening. But as far as questions, I pretty much cleared it up for me.
All right, fair enough.
Not really any questions.
I don't see anything in chat, so I'm going to move to the fifth party system. 1932, 1976. What happens? Well, basically what I was talking about goes full cycle, and it pretty much is started by this guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He builds out what we think of until very recently as the modern Democratic Party. Pro-labor, socially liberal, advancement of minority rights to some degree. Although he's not really much of a racist from what I can tell, but he's definitely an anti-Semite. But Roosevelt largely will look at this as that he takes what from his uncle, Teddy, he takes a lot of the pro-labor movements and he galvanizes them into the most powerful political force you've ever seen in the country. And this is largely because of the Great Depression, right? He has a lot of political capital to get stuff done, and he cements the seeds of what will become the Democratic Party for the next 80 years. And that is a pro-union party that supercharges them, basically reinforces them, and basically becomes the American version of the Labor Party, unironically. This won't hold forever, but largely what we have seen is that Roosevelt is kind of a reformist in that he's an elite. He knows exactly how all this stuff works out. He understands how business works. He understands how all of these things fall out in the way that they do. But he knows that there is no way he can keep that system running in the way that it has because the American people don't trust anymore. They're literally kind of in the situation where they are today, except 5 times worse, to where 1/4 of people don't have a job. Business looks like they are the most corrupt and evil people on the planet. He has to make major political transformations. And it takes him 4 administrations, or at least 3 and part of 1, to really solidify this. But he's stupidly popular because of it. This is the New Deal. These are all the new social welfare programs that we have, like Social Security, that basically build out the modern infrastructure. As far the modern political infrastructure to a large degree. Business runs off to the Republicans because that's the only place that they have a home in. And this isn't the party system that we 100% think of, but it is the party system that's starting to look very, very familiar to us today. And so, at least where we're at this point is that you have a very, very strong Democratic Party that will dominate this era, largely because of labor rights and a very big distaste from kind of the echo points that we're seeing today. Just a distaste for capitalism and business because they blame them for causing 1929. This will largely go on after World War II. The Democrats kind of get supercharged by that as well because government runs everything during World War II. There basically is no capitalism in the way that we think of it during that time. There's to some degree that there is and there isn't, but the government sets mandates for everything. How much we ration everything. We set production targets for everything. It's the closest thing every time we ever actually went to being a centrally planned economic system. And the long story short is Democrats get stupidly popular and stupidly strong off of this. And it literally takes a war hero to counter that out and actually make the Republicans into something again. That's Eisenhower. So let me bring this full cycle. Truman comes up in 45 after Roosevelt dies, and he's literally the guy that nobody wants. Comes up to 48. It's a pretty close election, and it's largely because Truman is seen as largely unpopular. He is an administrator. He is not the kind of guy that actually is the populist that caters to the crowd. He does things pretty well, but he runs again in 52 and absolutely gets stomped by Eisenhower, and largely that's because of Korea and the fact that he's kind of seen as indecisive. Eisenhower is kind of what we think of in the traditional sense of like the modern Republican, although not so bad of what we see with like Reagan. He's a liberal Republican. He's liberal, but he does favor business, and he's actually kind of like Joe Biden of today, unironically. He's very astute, knows how things work, and he's obviously very popular because he knows how to manage, and he's the World War II hero kind of thing. But the general level here is that he's an administrator, but he's popular, and he'll go down in history as one of the better presidents. Not because he actually has to deal with anything horrible. The Cold War is going on in full swing. People are worried about the Soviets and all this, but Eisenhower is very much the kind of guy that that makes everyone comfortable and happy. He makes the business community happy because he understands how business works and how it operates, and he, basically supports them. However, he makes the average person happy, even in labor, because he's the general. He understands what war can do. He doesn't want another one. He handles things very, very well. He steers the ship of state very well. Probably, if I'm going to be genuine, he's probably the best peacetime president we ever have. And so that largely leads us up into LBJ, which if there's actually any end date that I want to pick a fight with on this one, it's this one. I think the fifth party system largely dies with LBJ in 1964 and 1968. And that is largely built out ironically on race relations and minority rights, that kind of thing. And so what happens, at least to finish off this era, is that the Democrats are kind of in a rough spot. Business is getting more powerful because they're coming back and people don't have as much of disdain. You've had now a full generation that have lived in post-World War II, and they're doing really, really well, right? This is the baby boomers. Now they're growing up, but they're going to start voting here in the late 60s. They're going to go off to Vietnam. And the fundamental change here is that you see a group of people start coming up who are what we would call conservative today, but even then they're kind of conservative. They believe in like family values. They believe in managing your wallet. They believe in basically ensuring prosperity for the majority of people if you have earned it. They're the boomers, right? The Democrats start going a different way. They think that they want to continue the social advancement, and this is largely for people that are seen as kind of disenfranchised, particularly the black community. This is the Civil Rights Act, which we'll see towards the end of the Kennedy administration, that goes nowhere, but LBJ will pass it. This is the advancement of basically what we see today, the socially liberal progressive party that we see today in the Democrats. Is that this is the issues they start picking up on. There's a lot that can be said here, but I want to tag that in the six-party system as far as what this evolves into. But if there's any questions from the chat, if there's any questions from Marks on the fifth party system for me to solidify out, go ahead and ask them.
Would you say that? Sorry if you mentioned this before,
No,
but would you say like the fear of communism, like I believe the Red Scares have already gone through or going through in this area? Would you say that the fear of communism heavily shapes how the party system's laid out in this era?
Kind of yes, kind of no. The Red Scare is actually dates back all the way to 1917 or 1918 with the Russian revolutions. What really does galvanize these parties is, yes, the Cold War does galvanize them to where basically in 1944 or earlier, let's just say with the start of World War II, is that the nationalist crowd and what we think of starts getting defanged. The United States will no longer be a trade protectionist nation. We largely were up until this point. We will not. We pretty much drop isolationism because when World War II starts, we've got a military that is one active division. We have a Navy that's growing because we started rebuilding it, but we hadn't built anything new. Before 1940, we hadn't built anything new since 1929. And so, to a large degree of where we were at is that the United States will walk into World War II as a very isolationist nation trying to look in at itself. And when it leaves World War II, pretty much everyone agrees across the board, we can't go back to that. We can't, not be involved. Otherwise, we'll probably see another world war. And of course, you look at the world and literally, we just defeated Nazi Germany and fascist Japan and Italy. And we're staring at somebody that looks eerily similar, and that is the Soviet Union. Although they're communist and not fascist. That pretty much galvanizes everyone after the sacrifices that had been made during World War II, to where these parties pretty much just toss nationalism, protectionism, and what's the word I want to use here? It's not nationalism in the regard that we're better than everybody else. It's nationalism is that we should look after ourselves first and foremost. That kind of nationalism. A lot of these are just tossed out of the American political body, and pretty much by 1948, you will not see any of this to a large degree. That's largely how kind of focuses these parties, is that they agree on this. It does not make a dividing line, although there is I'll put it this way. The dividing line is this. The Republicans will largely market themselves on being tough on communism, and they'll be the party that markets themselves as better, better free than dead or something like that, or better free than a commie, right? That kind of thing, or better dead than a commie. That's what I mean. Yeah. Better dead than red. That's it. I'm sorry. I could not think of what it was. I was losing my mind. That's who the Republicans will market themselves as. The Democrats will market themselves on détente. They're like, hey, look, we don't like these people. We don't agree on a lot of things, but we can work together. We don't want the world to end in nuclear annihilation. And they'll largely be the pipe is like, look, we can work, we can deal. There's things we're not going to agree on, but at least if we can have a conversation, if we can get anywhere with things, we'll be the people to do it. And there's some points where they actually do sell this out pretty well. But on a general level here, the Republicans are able to use that as a beat stick and call the Democrats weak on communism. They both have points, and it kind of ebbs and flows as it goes along. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that answered it pretty well. Looking in chat. Seems like no more. Wait, what would you? Oh wait, that's not relevant. I think there's no real other questions. I think we can move on.
Okay. So the 6-party system is what we just ended with, right? Now, this was a Republican South, a Democratic North, which was something that before this is really odd. And there's actually a really good infographic here that has some stuff here that I just found out. But largely what we see is that you have the Southern strategy, you have civil rights, you have the suburbia form out, and all of these combined transition into what we think of as the old parties, like the things that people are still having troubles getting rid of in their mind because we've been so used to it. And largely that's pretty much from 1964 until 2016 is largely where I would draw this out. People still think that we're in the 6-party system. I'm calling it an end. The Democrats are what we think of, or what we did think of as traditionally as Democrats. For largely poor people, largely people that were disenfranchised. If you want, you can literally just call it the disenfranchised party. Or like the left-wing populist party. If you were poor, if you feel like the system didn't support you, if you were a minority, any of that kind of thing, you largely voted as a Democrat, and then pretty much the Republicans were the establishment party. Big business, evangelical conservatism, that kind of thing. And to make this full cycle go in is that this is what we saw for a very long time. I don't think I need to explain this to anyone. I think everyone knows like what that was, how it was working, how it went there. The only thing that I'll point here is a big talking point. A lot of people, both on the Democrats and the Republicans, believe that demographics is destiny. That the whole pitch for the Democrats during this era is, hey, look, young people agree with us. immigrants agree with us and the black community agrees with us, sooner or later, either people are going to become more liberal or basically an ethnic hodgepodge to where there's no way we can possibly lose. So far, they have been consistently proven wrong across the board. And I'm actually going to say that's part of why that the seventh party system is forming, is because this whole idea is screwed up. The Democrats went full bank on it, and it's actually blowing up in the process of blowing up in their face. But I'll put it this way. During this time, if you actually look at the numbers between who holds Congress and who holds the White House, the Democrats were not the majority party. They were the minority party, the opposition party. Not to say they weren't people that were in power, but if you look at the general overall trend, the Republicans actually dominate this system all the way up into the bitter end. The Democrats just couldn't get the rubber to hit the road in the way that the Republicans did. And even with a Republican Party that was actually the first to collapse, and that would be Donald Trump, the Republicans are still a force to be reckoned with, even going into the seventh party system. So, I'm going to open this up because there's so many ways I can take the six party system. If you have any questions about the six party system that you want me to highlight for you or underline, feel free to do that from chat or Marks, and then try to keep that separate from the transition questions, but we can do those too, because we can talk about where we are today and the seventh party system here in just a second. So, six party system questions for anyone out there. Oh my God, we're at 55 minutes.
No. Real quick, to keep it short.
Yeah.
For because I believe you said he destroyed it, the current party system in a sense.
He basically, the problem with I'm gonna fast forward this, and if anyone has any follow up questions or reversing questions, they can go back to this. What happened with the Republican Party is that they were built out of the establishment, right? So basically, suburbanites, middle class folks, and wealthy folks that felt secure in their situation, and were pretty happy with the status quo, right? The problem with that is that they actually just did themselves their own worst enemy. Both the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans openly brought in what we call free trade and outsourcing, and basically had everyone that we could trade with. This is China, Mexico, all this, right? The Democrats would actually get on board with this too. But what we've seen is a hollowing out of the support structures of both parties at the same time. So the Republicans used to be supported largely by vote, the middle class, which was large and vibrant, and basically it's the people that could, raise two kids, and either mom would, stay home, or she would be able to, work a couple hours a week, kind of thing. Dad, very traditional, right? In every way, shape, or the form of what we think of as traditional today. That was the Republican Party. Anyone who wasn't part of that was largely part of the Democrats. What has happened is that economically, the middle class has been destroyed, disenfranchised to the point where they cannot support that kind of Republican Party anymore. They cannot have conservatives that vote for economic conservatism, because that doesn't pay the bills anymore. Most of these people lost their jobs 15 years ago, and they've never got them back. The Democrats have the exact opposite problem. Liberals are in a state where they're actually up on the ascendancy. They actually have seen the advancement of social rights and civil rights across the board. And so you do have numerous people that are minorities and people that would largely be considered disenfranchised. And if you're the talking points today, they are still disenfranchised, but they make up not the lion's share, but a large portion of governors and elected representatives and CEOs and all these things. The change has started. I'm not going to say that it's equal by any stretch of the imagination, but you can find a lot of minorities everywhere that are doing very, very well. And there's something that has happened with them that is kind of like an idiosyncrasy desync in the Democratic Party. They're becoming libertarian. They are 100% in favor of supporting the social changes of BLM and social discourse, right? They're pro LGBTQIA, that whole thing, but they don't want to pay for it. That was fine whenever somebody else is paying for it, but now that they are actually like the new generation of wealthy people in the country, they're the CEOs' sons and daughters that are now becoming CEOs and high level operatives themselves. They don't want to pay the taxes anymore, and so they're rapidly becoming a libertarian party. In fact, if you look at the Biden administration, it's probably the most pro-business Democratic Party we've seen since the 20s, 100 years ago. So, what in the world is going on with chat? Yeah, that's a little weird, guys. Let's keep that under wraps. So, we're almost at time. We literally got like 10 seconds left before we hit an hour, so we'll try to wrap this up. We're in a transition. The old systems don't work anymore, and we're going to walk into a new era, which is a 7-party system, which is going to look not very recognizable to what we've seen before. We can talk about that, which is what I'm going to wrap up with. But if you guys have any questions with that, feel free to do so. And we actually just got one in chat. Wealth inequalities have nothing to do with that change. Actually, that's exactly what I tried to make the point is that the wealth inequalities and wealth differences is what's changed, is what has made this happen. Wealth inequality doesn't really matter to anybody, actually. This is going to blow people's minds. It's who has the wealth and who doesn't that matters. Whoever's rich, whoever's the people of the elite of the day, they want to keep their money, and whoever doesn't basically wants that money, right? The difference is that what happened yesteryear is that the right-wing people, like the socially conservative people, that kind of thing, they were the ones that had all the freaking money and basically had all the positions of power. Now it's being inverted. The left wing is now becoming the dominant people in finance and in politics, and it's changing. So now instead of having a socially and economically liberal party and a socially and economically conservative party, we're seeing that morph into a socially liberal, economically conservative party, that being the Democrats, and a socially conservative, economically liberal party in the Republicans. And that's where we're heading now, is because conservatives can't afford to be conservative anymore because they don't have the money to do that. Liberals don't want to advocate for liberals don't want to advocate for social welfare anymore because they're the ones that now actually have to pay for it. You're starting to see where people actually care right now. And for all the talking points the left has said about, being the party of the people, well, when they actually have to pay for things, it doesn't look like they actually want to pay for anything anymore. So if I'm correct, you'll see this trend continue. If I'm wrong, I'll eat my words on this one, but I actually feel pretty confident on this one. So any other questions while we're at it? And yeah, Mark's, get on this if you want to.
No, I think because we've talked about this a lot, I don't really have any more questions to do with this. Let me check the chat. Hold on. So, particularly the race thing. You said before about like at least I believe you said that usually minorities and other classes of those types would vote Democrats because they believe like they're the party of the people. To clarify, what you're saying is that as like wealth, people over time generally get more wealthy in this country, including minorities. Minorities are starting to shift more libertarian and are starting to shift away from the Democratic Party, and that's what's causing a lot of the existential crisis that's happening with the Democrats.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're making clarification. That's what I'm looking for. The long and the short here is that while some people are probably going to be like, well, what about the African American community? They're in a rut. They're in a very bad place. I'm not going to act like they're not. But almost every other minority group in this country is doing as well as white people are, or doing even better. Or at least by the data that I'm seeing. And if anyone's going to say, well, what about Hispanics? Remember that the only reason why that is as low as it is, and that's $10,000 less than the average white person, is because we're having a flood of Hispanic people coming up from Central America that are pushing their numbers down because they have basically the equivalent of an eighth grade education, and most of them are used to making something on the order of $15,000 a year. Even when they get here, they either double or triple their income, and even though they their highest aspiration might be managing the 7-Eleven they come to work at, and I'm not trying to be derogatory when I say that. I love these people; they're great folks. They collectively en masse push down the numbers of the Hispanic community, because if you look at the numbers of their kids and their grandkids, which are either here or yet to be born, but for the ones that are already here, they're the second generation are usually competitive with white Americans, and the third generation are usually beating them by about $5,000, which means that this is if anyone saw the debate that I was on more recently about white privilege, it doesn't really make any sense, because outside of the black community as a pejorative whole, like, when you group most people into the five core groups, everyone else is doing better than white people. And so what we're seeing here is that economic change is now reflecting in our politics, is that rich Asians and rich Hispanics don't really want to pay for social welfare programs anymore because they actually have the money and they're the ones getting taxed.
Oh, wait, am I lying?
No, you're fine. I'm going to
Yeah.
close out with one fire note because we're at 105 and I want to close out before 110. And so I'll do a bit of an AMA. If you guys have any questions, feel free. If you're listening to the podcast or whatever, or watching the show, post them down below, or send me a message. Ask me the questions that you have for the follow up for this episode, because this went way longer than I thought it would. Tomorrow's voter blocks, as I see them, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here. For the Democrats, we have capitalists. This will largely be the business community writ large. You'll have commuters. You'll have the eco-geeks, the environmentalists. You'll have globalists. This is going to be a little weird, but these are people that are largely going to say, look, I want to deal economically with the rest of the world, particularly with Southeast Asia and whatnot. This might change with my forecast, considering the Second Cold War is starting to kick off in a real big way. But I don't think they're going to be. I don't think both parties are going back to globalism. I think you're going to have a Democratic Party that will reflect what more globalist talking points and policy, but you won't see that over the Republicans anymore. And so let's keep it going. You'll have socially liberal people, or what we call liberals, people who advance liberal rights outside of guns. For some reason, they can't do guns right, but hey, whatever. I have middle class in this one. Yeah, I'm going to keep that. Middle class has largely become socially liberal. They want to feel good about doing the right thing and voting the right way. And so they've kind of fallen with the rich folks right now, in that they want to feel good about doing anything, or about being socially liberal. They just don't want to pay for it. And so the middle class and the rich folks are largely going to be the genesis of what the Conservative Party used to be, just in the reverse way. Instead of being socially conservative and maintaining things, they're going to be socially liberal. Parents. This won't be verbatim, but most people, I think, I might actually have to move this to the other party. But parents will largely be reflected upon education and paying for school, that kind of thing. A lot of these programs that parents are going to look forward to, in that the Democrats will pay for certain things that they really like, and not pay for the things that parents won't want to. I can revisit that later. The retired, absolutely. Pushing up your 401k is absolutely a good thing. The retired are going to love that. The biggest voter block that coming into this will actually be secularists, people that don't like the religious folks, and that want to oppose them at every level. This group is getting big, fast. And the more that people, thump their Bibles, the more that this becomes a politically active voter block. It'll probably be the biggest one that the Democrats can have coming into the new era. And then finally is the wealthy, which I already talked about with the middle class. Republicans will be social conservatives, motorists, basically anyone who really cares about their car a lot and people who actually need to use gasoline. Nationalists, and this will largely be everything from, hey, look, we need to look after America first, to people that are like, let's invade Canada. That's coming. All of that is coming back, and we've seen that with Donald Trump. That they're probably already the biggest voter bloc in in history as of right now. However, they kind of are being usurped by another one, which we'll talk about here in a second. Poor people. Unironically, we've already seen that this change has started. 10-point swing in the last 4 years. Poor people are probably going to be Republican voters before too long. And if at the rate they're going, they already are. We'll have to see where this divide comes between the urban poor and the rural poor. But as a pejorative whole, poor people are going to be Republican voters. The biggest one that the Republicans are going to have, which is going to be the other side of the political gravity that I talked about earlier, is the religious voters. I'm not going to say they're going to be Christian. They might actually branch out into other folks, particularly the Muslim community. I'd love to see them actually try this because they can actually win over votes there if they can break up the whole intersectionality nonsense. But it would work out very well for them because they're very socially conservative, and if Republicans can get a socially conservative, economically or liberal party off the ground, which it looks like they're heading into, that's going to pull pretty much everyone that Republicans could never get to vote for them, at least within I want to say shooting distance, but that's really the wrong phrase I want to use here. It's going to put a lot of people in voting distance that you never saw coming. I'll talk about that here as we end out, but the primary political gravity that I see coming is the religious community versus the secularist community. They're going to be the loudest voices, and you can kind of see the political antagonism on both sides of the aisle with that. To finish this out, self-employed Republican, socialists. Yes, people who actually want worker-owned co-ops and that kind of thing, they will be very, very much Republicans 10 to 20 years from now because they're actually going to be the pro-labor party. And we already see that with the next group of people, unions. Unions have already flipped. And then the last part is the young people. I think that's a bit loaded. I might actually scratch them out altogether because young people don't really vote all that well. And they're going to be split up between socially liberal folks that are, kind of teaching them as teachers, but also between the economic liberalism that you get usually when you're young, where you want everyone else to pay for everything. If this becomes a solid Republican voting bloc, I'll put it this way. It'll be because Republicans can flip teachers. That's going to be a 20-year project, but it's actually possible for them to do. I'm eagerly awaiting to see what happens with that. So to pull this full stop, because a lot of people are already asking about this, Republicans are in a very interesting situation because they have shown across the board they can gain in every group when it comes to race and wealth. They're losing and bleeding out on the white vote. They're losing and bleeding out on the rich people vote. But they're gaining immensely on poor voters, and they're gaining immensely with Hispanics. The black community isn't moving terribly much on this matter, but that may change, particularly with the more and more people that are Hispanic getting into that party. The long story short is I don't expect a Republican minority party to come out. I think the demographics are basically going out to where you can never have a minority party again. But what you're going to see is that you're going to see every racial group split in a sizable way on whether they're voting Republican or Democrat, which is probably good because we might actually see the race conversation toned down for once. And that'd be awesome, personally. But I'm not sure where that's going to go. And I blew past 110 already. We're at 112. So, I don't know where this chat's going, but I'm going to have to go take care of it. So, if anyone wants to have any questions, please contact me. If you want to check this out on the other platforms, feel free to do that. I already did all the promos at the beginning of the show. Thanks for coming by. I'm sorry that this became such a long episode, but I hope it was very interesting for you. I've been Tiberius D with Daddy Marks, signing out.